In today's program, 4 historical facts that prove Jesus really rose from the dead.
The first of these is the honorable burial of Jesus. The second of these is the discovery of his empty tomb. Third would be the post-mortem appearances of Jesus. And fourth would be the origin of the disciples' belief that Jesus was risen from the dead.
AD 20, there ain't such a thing as the Christian church. By AD 120, the emperor in Rome is getting worried letters from one of his proconsuls off in northern Turkey about what to do about these Christians. So in that century, you have this extraordinary thing suddenly appearing out of nowhere. And all the early Christians for whom we have actual evidence would say, I'll tell you why it's happened, it's because of Jesus of Nazareth and the fact that he was raised from the dead.
We invite you to listen to 8 world-famous scholars tell why the evidence proves Jesus really rose from the dead.
Now here's another question. Do archaeologists think they have evidence that shows where Jesus was crucified and where he was buried? To answer these questions and to get a clear picture of what happened to Jesus at the end of his life, there are certain historical facts which must be examined.
It seems to me that there are 4 fundamental historical facts which any credible historian must account for if he's to give a tenable historical hypothesis about the fate of Jesus of Nazareth. The first of these is the honorable burial of Jesus. The second of these is the discovery of his empty tomb. Third would be the post-mortem appearances of Jesus. And fourth would be the origin of the disciples' belief that Jesus was risen from the dead. Now, with respect to the first of those, the burial of Jesus, the majority of New Testament scholars who have written on this subject agree that Jesus of Nazareth was buried by Joseph of Arimathea in a tomb.
Scholars believe Jesus was honorably buried by Joseph of Arimathea because of the early historical evidence. Jewish archaeologist Dr. Gabriel Barkai is considered to be the foremost authority on tombs in Jerusalem during the time of Jesus.
The details that we have in the Gospels about the burial of Jesus, they fit well with the evidence that we have in the field.
What the Gospels say is that Jesus of Nazareth was laid in a tomb by this enigmatic figure, Joseph of Arimathea, who appears out of nowhere in the Gospels, and contrary to expectation, gives Jesus of Nazareth an honorable burial in a tomb. Moreover, Mark tells us that this man was a member of the Sanhedrin, the very council which had just condemned Jesus to be crucified, and that Joseph singles out Jesus among the trio of men that had been crucified for special care by giving him an honorable burial in a tomb, rather than allowing the body to simply be dispatched into a common grave reserved for criminals. This is extraordinary and requires some sort of explanation.
In fact, we discovered that archaeologists think the Church of the Holy Sepulchre may mark the actual site of the tomb in which Jesus was buried by Joseph of Arimathea.
Obviously, this is the traditional site where Christians think that Jesus was buried. You were asked to do the archaeological work, or part of the archaeological work on this site. Tell me, do you think this is the place where Jesus was actually?
Well, there's very high probability, very high probability.
Dr. Megan Broshi is a respected Jewish archaeologist and scholar on the Second Temple period. He was asked to conduct the excavation at the Church of the Holy Sepulchre for a rather unusual reason.
They invited me to participate in the dig. What was very important for them that I was an infidel, I wasn't a Christian. They didn't want Catholics, they didn't want Greek Orthodox. They wanted somebody was absolutely neutral, and that was the case.
Now, the evidence Dr. Broschi found while excavating at the Church of the Holy Sepulchre led him to defend it as the most reasonable place for the burial of Jesus. I asked him why.
For two reasons. One reason is that the tradition should be trusted. It was too important to be forgotten. And there was a Christian community in Jerusalem, around Jerusalem, that would have carried on, handed it over from one generation to the other. And the second reason is the area was a graveyard at the time of Jesus. It was a graveyard, and there are several graves around here. There were more, but they've been obliterated by later building activity.
All four Gospels report Joseph of Arimathea requested permission from Pilate to bury Jesus, and that his body was laid in a tomb cut out of solid rock. Three of the writers say the tomb was new, that is, no one had ever been laid in the tomb before. All four accounts mention a stone that was rolled against the entrance to the tomb. Matthew adds, it was a large stone.
If Jesus was in fact buried by a Jewish Sanhedrist in Jerusalem, as the Gospels claim, that means that the location of Jesus' tomb was known to both Jew and Christian alike. But in that case, it's impossible to imagine how a movement founded on belief in the resurrection of a dead man who had been publicly executed in Jerusalem could arise and flourish in the face of a tomb containing his corpse. So that those scholars who want to deny such things as the empty tomb, the resurrection appearances, also find themselves forced to deny the fact of the honorable burial of Jesus, despite the fact that this is one of the earliest and best attested facts about the historical Jesus that we have. It's extremely awkward for them.
Some people say, well, the answer to that is that the disciples stole the body. That's why the tomb was empty.
Nobody says that anymore. That theory has been completely abandoned since the early 1800s. No responsible scholar holds to such a thing.
But why have scholars concluded the disciples did not steal Jesus' body? And why have they abandoned the theory that Jesus didn't die on the cross, that he just fainted or swooned?
In his major work in 1835 in the life of Jesus, he said the swoon theory is not going to work, and the problem was this: it is self-contradictory. What you have from the swoon is a living Jesus, but not a resurrected Jesus. And here's how it works. Jesus should have died on the cross. He didn't. He should have died in the tomb. He didn't. He certainly can't roll the stone away. No problem. He did. Now, Strauss didn't believe in a guard, but for those who believe a guard sitting out there, he works his way through the guards. But here's the problem for Strauss. Again, you got didn't die on the cross, didn't die in the tomb, couldn't roll the stone. He comes to where the disciples are. He knocks on the door. What's this man going to look like? He's a human Jesus. He's been crucified. He's worked the wounds open again. He's bleeding from the scalp. His hair's not even been washed. I mean, you got sweat and blood, and he's worked the side open again, and he's hunched over, and he's limping, and he's pale. And I told you I would rise again from the dead. The problem, Strauss said, with the swoon theory is you get a Jesus who's alive, but you don't get a Jesus who's raised. Now, Strauss does not believe in the resurrection, but he knows the disciples did. And the problem is, swoon can't account for the experiences that the disciples had that they thought were appearances of the risen Jesus.
In addition, the second major fact which historians must evaluate is the empty tomb.
The majority of scholars who have written on this subject agree that the tomb of Jesus was probably found empty by a group of his women followers early on Sunday morning. That represents the historical core of the empty tomb narrative as we find it in Mark. Secondly, I think that the empty tomb story is also multiply and independently attested in early sources.
The empty tomb was preached very early. You've got Paul in 1 Corinthians 15 saying, he died, he was buried, what went down is what came out, and what came out is what appeared.
Why is that solid evidence?
Well, because critics, if you're using this methodology that says we'll use the facts critics admit and facts which are well attested, Paul is admitted to be an eyewitness. The book in which his testimony appears is already early, about 25 years after the cross, but then the creedal passage that he reports of, that early tradition from verses 3 and following, 1 Corinthians 15, is earlier still, and in Galatians 1 and 2, he's got apostolic confirmation of his message from Peter and James in Galatians 1, Peter, James, and John in Galatians 2. So you've got this intricate, interwoven, an accredited eyewitness messenger with an early book, with an even earlier creed, and it's teaching our fact here in question, the empty tomb.
Further, there is one final piece of evidence that proves Jesus' tomb was empty. The Jewish leaders themselves testified to this fact.
The earliest Jewish response to the proclamation of the resurrection was not to point to the occupied tomb, but rather to say that the disciples had stolen the body. It was itself an attempt to explain away why the body was missing. So that we have here evidence from the very enemies of the earliest Christian movement in favor of the empty tomb. Evidence which is simply top drawer because it comes not from the Christians, but from the very opponents of the early Christian movement.
The historical evidence shows Jesus was crucified on a cross. His body was laid in a tomb that was cut out of solid rock. And 3 days later, that tomb was found empty. So what happened to Jesus' body? We will turn to that question next.
Coming up, we'll explore the resurrection of Jesus. What proof do we have that this event actually occurred?
For the Jew, the resurrection was an event that took place in space and time, in history. And therefore, something more is needed than just hallucinations of the dead man to explain why they came to believe in the resurrection of Jesus, rather than merely his translation into heaven.
We'll also look at the rise of Christianity when Jesus, the Search Continues, returns.
Historians believe that after watching Jesus die on the cross, his disciples fled in despair. But then something happened, and historians raise the question, what caused the disciples to change their mind and proclaim Jesus was alive, that he was the Messiah, the Son of God?
Well, in terms of the psychological profile of the disciples, if we believe that it is true that they denied, deserted, and betrayed Jesus, that they had given him up for lost when he died on the cross, psychologically, something significant had to have happened to change all of their minds about this particular issue after the crucifixion of Jesus. Because remember, no early Jews were looking for a crucified Messiah. That would be, if you wanted to scotch the rumor that Jesus was Messiah, get him crucified, that would prove that he was cursed, not blessed by God.
All of this leads us to our third fact.
The third fundamental fact that any responsible historical hypothesis has to account for in explaining the fate of Jesus of Nazareth is the fact that after his death, different individuals and groups of people claim to have seen Jesus of Nazareth alive from the dead on different occasions and under varying circumstances. Now, this general fact is one that is universally acknowledged today among New Testament critics.
But according to the historical sources, how many people claim to have seen Jesus?
Now, of course, the key list there is in 1 Corinthians 15. In that list, you have individuals, leaders of the church. Paul starts with Peter, ends with himself, in the middle has James, the brother of Jesus. 3 key individuals who saw the risen Jesus. But you also have groups, and that's very important to ascertain some evidence for these appearances. You have the 12, you have a group he calls all the apostles, you have more than 500 brethren, most of whom remain alive. Now, when you go to the Gospels, and I think also with good grounds, we have, for example, the women. You have several women at the tomb, and probably Mary Magdalene alone as she returns. So you've got them citing Jesus as well as the empty tomb. And again, if you're going to put your best foot forward, you do not use women because they can't go to a law court. You're not going to impress people in first century Palestine. By far the best reason for starting with the women and secondarily with Mary is very simple. They saw the risen Jesus. Now the Gospels also tell us about a long walk with 2 men on the way to Emmaus. I mean, it takes a while to walk and talk for miles with this visitor who turns out to be Jesus. You have appearances to the groups of disciples. You have in John 20 all the disciples present except, of course, Judas and Thomas. You have a second appearance a week later with Thomas in the famous incident where Thomas asks for evidence. So you've got a wide range of activities. You've got men and you've got women. You've got individuals and you've got groups. You've got indoors, outdoors, sitting, standing, fishing, making a shore lunch, walking with them, hanging on by the ankles, wide variety.
But scholars want to know, what did these people really see? Did they see Jesus in his physical body or in some kind of a vision?
Most scholars would certainly say the disciples believed that they saw Jesus. And many of them would just want to leave it there and say, okay, it was a subjective phenomena that happened here. But if you interpret those gospel documents about the resurrection appearances of the risen Lord, and you interpret the Pauline evidence and the rest of the New Testament evidence, they were claiming far more than that. They were claiming to actually have a physical encounter with Jesus after his death, that he ate, that he was tangible, could be touched, that he was still moving in space and time as a real person. So they were claiming more than just having had a vision of Jesus.
Now, if the resurrection had not happened, then we wouldn't be here speaking. There would have been no Christian movement.
If there had been people there with tape recorders and cameras, they would have had photographic and audio images of Jesus appearing in the upper room.
Now the question is, did the disciples know the difference between a real physical appearance of Jesus as compared to a vision of Jesus in their minds?
Now, it's interesting that the New Testament draws a clear distinction between appearances of Christ and visions of Christ. The appearances of the risen Christ were to a limited circle and soon ceased. But visions of the exalted Christ went on in the New Testament church.
What can be said to those who believe Jesus' disciples were only having hallucinations of Jesus?
What's wrong with the hallucination theory? Probably no theory has more problems. Problem number one, groups of people, not even two at once, see the same hallucination. An hallucination is something that you believe so firmly that you invent the mental picture. Two cannot share in an hallucination any more than two can share a dream. If you have examples of group appearances, and you have them, for example, 3 in 1 Corinthians 15, 3 and following, those are not hallucinations, not as a group. Secondly, it's granted by everybody, both from Scripture and from psychology, that you can't have exuberant, expecting disciples after this calamity. Best friend, livelihood, everything's destroyed, and they're supposed to be hoping for a resurrection and making these sorts of images. So second, they're not in the right frame of mind. 3 may be the most devastating one. Too many different people, times, places. You have men, you have women, indoors, outdoors, walking, standing, everything. The problem is to believe that every one of these people manufactured a private, individual hallucination is beyond credulous. We rarely even see hallucinations today, but they were just supposed to have them on demand. That's too problematic. Fourth problem, if the disciples were seeing hallucinations, we got a little problem with the empty tomb. It wouldn't be empty. And so the leaders are saying, fellows, we got a problem here. Now critics say, come on, 50 days later, what would the body look like? Hey, look, it doesn't make a difference. This body looks like it's crucified. Here's the nails, this is your man, blows the theory away. So the empty tomb is a death blow to hallucination.
Now the fourth historical fact, accepted by all historical scholars, is that the disciples believed Jesus appeared to them and proved he had risen from the dead.
The origin of Christianity is actually itself one of the most extraordinary phenomena in the history of the world. AD 20, there ain't such a thing as the Christian church. By AD 120, the emperor in Rome is getting worried letters from one of his proconsuls off in northern Turkey about what to do about these Christians. So in that century, you have this extraordinary thing suddenly appearing out of nowhere. And all the early Christians for whom we have actual evidence would say, I'll tell you why it's happened, it's because of Jesus of Nazareth and the fact that he was raised from the dead.
Now, if we face these 4 historical facts squarely, namely, the honorable burial of Jesus, the empty tomb, the appearances of Jesus after his death, and the disciples' belief that Jesus was risen from the dead, these 4 facts call for the conclusion that Jesus rose from the dead.
We have framed this argument to take facts which believers and unbelievers hold in common. And what we want the critic to understand here is these are your facts. They're in your books. They're in everybody's books. The disciples believed they saw the risen Jesus. How do you stop this path from thought they saw to really saw? You come up with a naturalistic theory. And I want them to take one of those and run with it. Don't hide behind something happened. Tell me what these facts indicate. I think we're pushing straight toward the resurrection of Christ.
I believe that when you assess the various alternatives, the various live options, using the ordinary canons of historical assessment, that the best explanation for the facts is that God raised Jesus of Nazareth from the dead.
Now, if God did raise Jesus from the dead, what was he trying to tell us?
I think the gospel is the good news that God has provided a way to come into your life forever. Not as a ticket, okay, but into a relationship. And he has provided the way to that relationship through the person and work of Jesus Christ. Not only the sacrifice for sins, but the provision of his very own Spirit coming into your life so that you can relate to God on a healthy level and overcome the sinfulness that is inherent in you. And the good news is that God is committed to that relationship, so committed to that relationship that he sent his only Son to die that it might take place. And the only requirement that exists, it's a serious requirement, the only requirement is that you believe that he's done that for you, and in faith you ask for that relationship through Jesus Christ. It's that simple and that demanding, because once God comes into your life, he's in it to do a marvelous work, a work that grounds you in a relationship with God that will never end.
And so the search for Jesus brings us to this point. What have we discovered?
So if a person is going to say, Jesus is not going to be important in my life, I'm not going to believe in him, then they're going to have to say that for other reasons besides historical. The evidence is there, the sources are there, the picture is clear and coherent, and in my academic opinion, the picture is quite compelling.
Therefore, the historian, whether that historian be a secularist, a Muslim, a Christian, whatever, the historian has to say, how do we explain the fact that this movement spread like wildfire with Jesus as the Messiah, even though Jesus had been crucified? And the answer has to be, it can only be because he was raised from the dead.
The claim of the resurrection of Jesus alone makes him unique among religious figures of the world. The fact that we have rather good evidence for it makes it more than unique, it makes it astonishing.